Daily Report. With me, George Maringa. I want to introduce my guest who is here with me. I will be speaking to Wanjohi Njoroge, a climate and nature restoration consultant. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, on the other side is Victor Muyakane and Linda Alela. They have their panelists, their guests who told you tonight. It's a different people's court, as our guests are not only from the from our country here in Kenya. We also have representatives from other African countries. Linda and Victor will be taking us through who they have. But before we get there, let's give you some facts and some figures and some numbers here for you, especially on matters of food security in Africa. And it's that 1 in 5 Africans goes to bed hungry, and an estimated 140 million people in Africa face acute food insecurity. Now, over 7.3 million children are likely to be acutely malnourished in Kenya, and other countries seriously affected include Somalia and Ethiopia. More than 5.5 million Africans are moderately malnourished. Now, this data is according to the World Food Programme, WFP report on regional food security and nutrition of 2022. Now, to closer home on matters Africa, food security in Kenya, and 9,621 metric tons of food commodities have been distributed, and $7.8 million or 1.38 billion shillings cash-based transfers have been made, $82.5 million or 12 billion shillings net funding requirements across all activities, and 1.8 million people were assisted in June 2023. This is data from the WFP. Now, 80% of the Kenya landmass is either arid or semi-arid. 19 counties are in the normal drought phase. This indicates that more favorable conditions in those areas compared to 2022. And as of June 2023, Taita Taveta County remained in the alert drought phase. Isiolo, Marsabit, and Kwale counties are in the recovery phase, and several countries are showing progress towards better conditions. This is data from WFP, the World Food Programme. And this is what sets the base for our conversation tonight towards a food secure Africa. As Ali mentioned, I have Wanjohi Njoroge seated here with me on this side of the studio. She is a climate and nature restoration consultant. Thank you so much, Wanjohi, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. You have, of course, followed the Africa Climate Summit 2023 since yesterday, today being the second day, tomorrow is the home stretch's last day. Has the issue or the conversation on food security been adequately addressed? And it's rather interesting to know that you fit in the youth bracket. So it's, I mean, as a young person, are you seeing that this conversation has been adequately addressed, especially at the summit? I
would first congratulate them because I think I have seen 2 panels discussing food transformation systems, food system transformation for Africa, which I think is a step in the right direction. But with just the numbers that you've given us of 1 in 5 Africans, 140 million Africans face insecurity, I think time has come for us to move from conversations to action. Africa has different regions. We in Kenya are in the East African Community region. We have SADC, we have West African region. How are we coming together to talk about food security? And if I'm hungry, I don't care about climate change or what it does, because my priority is feeding me. So I wouldn't even think about job creation. I'll not even think about saving the environment before I feed myself. So the primary conversation, in fact, the theme for this year's summit really should not be, or the biggest conversation should not be, in my view, carbon credits, but how do we ensure that Africa is food secure? How do we move from the 3 major foods that we produce, that is rice, wheat, and maize, to other foods that are drought resistant, for instance? And when you look at something like sorghum, it's used to produce beer, it's used to feed cows. And we have countries that are doing very, very well in the agricultural space in Africa. For instance, Botswana is a leading producer of beef. And when you look at the way they produce their beef, it's through the free range, or what we call in Swahili kienyeji, and through natural methods. And they're able to export nearly 8,000 tons to EU, 10,000 tons to South Africa. So it's actually possible. Africa before colonization, and I know we have made advancements now, but even as late as 1978, Kenya was able to produce its own sugar, for instance, for domestic consumption and exporting. So what is a missing link? And this conversation, in my view, was missing. We continue to produce maize. We have a small farm where we produce maize in Nyeri County, and it's not doing well.
Okay.
And this is a conversation that we need to start having, that we are experiencing extreme weathers. We have either very, very hot sun or very, very heavy rains that are coming to destroy our lands. So at times we even have overproduction. The other time we have underproduction. How do we ensure that the system or the process from growing to harvesting to market to consumption is taken care of? I think that was missing in this summit.
Absolutely. And then now, great points you raised there, because we will be coming later on to have now the conversation, Wanjohi, on how to progress the conversation forward, even as we discuss matters carbon credit, all these issues we're seeing at the Africa Climate Summit, but even as we seek solutions, especially for Kenya and Africa in general. I want you to hand you over to Victor Muyakane. He has got a panel of experts who will be able to take us through on matters, of course, food security in Africa. Victor, over to you.
Thank you, George. And with me, I've got two people, eminent personalities indeed, people who have a lot of insight to share with us this evening. To my left is a lady who joins us ancestrally from the nation of Nigeria, but professionally from the nation of South Africa. And her name is Olawumi Olabusare. Am I saying it properly?
You're saying it very well.
Thank you very much. She joins us from the One organization where she's a policy officer, and she's somebody who's passionate about, among many other things, governance, and that's something we'd like to talk to you about. We also have Dr. Richard Odwor. Thank you so much for joining us. He's joining us from the Kenyatta University, and he's actually the dean, the registrar for research, and he's somebody who's well versed in biotechnology, and we want you to share some of that insight on this conversation tonight. But I've got a question for you straight away. Where are we when it comes to food security from where you sit?
We are at a very bad place. And thank you again, Victor, for inviting me. I am a professor of molecular and cell biology at Kenyatta University and serving as the Registrar of Research, Innovation and Product Development.
Thank you.
What is more interesting here for me is that I see Africa that has all the resources that are necessary, but the one that is really starving at the same time. And therefore, even as we discuss, we need to look at very interesting interventions that will start looking at the food security from the soil preparation, the seed that goes into the soil, the process of agronomic traits, harvesting and post-harvest losses. All that value chain has a lot of intervention that we really need to look at. And we are not at a good place. And if we continue this way, we are likely to be the continent that is condemned to incessant food insecurity, and this is not good for us.
And while we're on the subject, isn't it significant that the bulk of our farmers in Africa are not young people? And young people are here with us, represented by you, Olawumi. Talk to us a little bit about, from where you sit, what do you see is Africa's food security situation?
Sure, and thank you for calling me young. I appreciate that, and thank you for having me here. So Africa's food security situation, I think the statistics that were shared earlier really speak to them. We're struggling to feed ourselves. And as a continent with 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, that's just unacceptable, right? It's not that we don't have the necessary resource of land, for example, right, that we can cultivate. It's about our processes being efficient, and it's also about lack of access to the inputs that farmers need to produce enough food for our population. And part of that is obviously being affected by climate change that's making harvests more prone to losses because of drought or flooding or just unpredictable weather patterns. And then we also have the geopolitical element of the situation, right? So because we are not very good at producing at the level that we need, it means that we have to import a lot of our food, a lot of the wheat, the rice, the maize that our previous speaker mentioned. And with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has made those grains a lot more expensive. And with the hike of interest rates in higher income countries, that has also made the costs more expensive because we have to buy that grain in foreign currency that is now more expensive to buy. So we have two things that are making, that are contributing to this issue of food insecurity on the continent. The poor agricultural productivity, but also the geopolitical situation that is making our imports expensive. Yeah.
Right. And we do hope to delve a little bit deeper, in these subjects that we're bringing up at this point. Linda, I wonder who you have. Well, I know, but I'd like you to introduce them to our audiences, and I'd like you to tell us, for them to tell us where they sit on this subject. Linda, over to you.
Well, as the rule would go, we begin with the ladies first, and because we only have one on set, I think I have the pleasure of introducing Rukia Hamis, Africa Regional Organizer. That is at 350africa.org. Right next to me and right next to Rukia is Zaki Mamdou. Zaki Mamdou is the coordinator Stop ECOP campaign. And next to him is Josephat Kinyua. Josephat Kinyua is the founder of Food Corp Consumer Cooperative Society Limited. And lastly, we have none other than Maimoni Ubrijo, who is seated on my farthest right. And of course, all the way from Nigeria as well. We acknowledge that. Friends of the Earth Africa is here, courtesy of that. And I want to agree, or I want to believe that a majority of us this evening are seated here, but equally are seated in Nairobi, courtesy of the Africa Climate Summit that we're having today. So the biggest question is that, one, we appreciate that summit, and we're looking forward to see whether there are going to be any form of declarations that will be declared in relation to food security. But, it takes us back to the Maputo Declaration, which was all about food security as well, close to 20 years of it. And most of the countries have actually not even met the 10% target. And we're here talking about food security, and first of all, in relation to the climate. Just how best placed are we? And I think we start with you, Josephat, who's seated largely in the world of food.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Josephat Kinyua, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you for TV47, the panelists and the hosts. So the biggest issue that, according to us, because we come from the consumer side of the food security systems, in regards to Maputo Declaration, the 10% budgetary allocation that was to be set by governments hasn't been reached so far, 20 years down the line. The other part is that the climate financing budgets, only less than 3% goes to agri-food systems. And it's a big worry, because for us as consumers, or coming from the consumer side of the value chain, we are looking at access, availability, and affordability of food.
Yeah.
And if financing is not there, then it's a big challenge for consumers to access this food, and also a big challenge for small-scale farmers, who are the majority of food producers in Africa, to be sustainable in food production.
All right, before I even go to the individuals, and you talk about sustainability, and you're talking about financing, perhaps Zaki would come in relation to that. We have seen lots of funding, global funding for that matter, the global players concerned about the question of food security at the global perspective, and a majority of them will send donations to Africa, will send funding to Africa. World Bank itself has crucially been involved in this process. Why is it that we still talk about funding, and what will it take for us to make sure that we put funding that is there to use, so that even moving forward, if more comes, then we're better placed to address this matter?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on the show.
Pleasure.
My name is Zaki Mamdou. I'm the coordinator of the Stop ECOP campaign. If I could briefly just mention that the ECOP campaign is the Stop ECOP campaign rather, is a campaign that has been set up to confront the development of the East African crude oil pipeline, which would be the world's longest heated crude oil pipeline, if the project itself comes to fruition. And I'd gladly speak a bit more about the campaign and about the project itself as the show progresses. Excuse me. In relation, I think a key point that we'd like to raise in this discussion is around the way in which projects like this, which exacerbate the climate crisis, but specifically in relation to ECOP and others like it, where these are projects that utilize a lot of land and disrupt incredibly important water sources and biodiversity hotspots, etc., stand to exacerbate the crisis of food insecurity that we are confronted by across this continent. And I think it is, and that is through the exacerbation of the looming threats of climate collapse itself, and the lessening viability of being able to cultivate enough food within a climate that is under threat and under pressure. But I think another critical point to raise is just around food systems themselves. And this, I think, is relevant to the conversation that we'll get into around finance. But, part of the issue here is the commodification of food, which is something that I think is important to address, the way in which food is produced and sold for profit, as opposed to being produced and sold in order to meet the needs of people, in order to provide basic nutrition. In the country that I come from, which is South Africa, the amount of waste that we see from major corporations who put food out to the consumers is really disgusting, and it's something to address is our food systems. The way in which we produce food needs to change drastically and needs to shift, and we need to really center the needs of people, but also use it as an opportunity to address our interlocking crises of joblessness and exclusion. Because if we change our food systems, particularly to ones which are socially owned, which are set up specifically with the core purpose and mandate of meeting the needs of people. Right. That would make a fundamental difference.
And I think as we progress, I agree, we are going to get to spaces where we just get to understand what exactly is food security, because we'll be talking about production, but then we've not looked at the storage aspect. We have not looked at how we find ourselves transporting this food from point A to point B. And you speak about biodiversity, and of course it's equally been estimated that the global food system is actually responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore we're talking about second only to the energy sector. And then this, of course, is the number one source, of course, we'd want to say, of methane and biodiversity loss, which is basically what you highlight as well. But even before we come to that aspect, perhaps we come to you, Rukia, who's seated right next to me. And I mean, amidst all these aspects of, focus on making sure that we are food secure as Africa, as a global fraternity, we still have difficulties when it comes to the question of policies, when it comes to the question of implementation. I mean, with these conversations and within our leaders, within our how do we have a unified voice towards making sure that Africa is food secure, and as well just getting the global fraternity to join in to make sure that Africa is food secure?
Thank you, Linda. Then thank you everyone for having me at the show. I think it's beautiful that you mentioned policy, because the beauty of the African continent is we have amazing policies. We don't lack on policies. Unfortunately, the implementation part is the issue, as you mentioned before. And I think when it comes to the common voice, that's the most crucial part. And I think the Africa Climate Summit is the first of its kind, and it's happening in our country and in our continent. So this is giving us an opportunity for our leaders, our communities, our civil society to really come together and really kind of coin what's the main goal, what's the main objective that Africa One Voice is saying. And as you know, the COP28 is coming in not so far away. It's like 2 months in November, and that's going to be a global platform where they want to know what's the plan for Africa. What are you guys thinking about food security? So I think I like that we're tying in food security with the climate nexus, because I don't feel they're separate, and I'm curious to see how the conversation progresses as well.
All right, Friends of the Earth Africa. I would want to assume it's largely about how we take care of the environment so that it can take care of us, in future. And that then would mean providing food for us. That then would mean, giving us, a a fair ground for us to live in as a people. Do you suppose that we have taken care of the earth, that we have taken care of Mother Nature, to the magnitude that then it would guarantee us security to all these important factors of life?
Thank you very much. I am the Climate Justice and Energy Program Coordinator for Friends of the Earth Africa, and I like your question very well. I want to take us back that the issue of food insecurity in Africa is a system that has been designed and pushed on Africa so that investment on agro-commodities and large-scale agricultural projects and initiative can try.
Maimoni, allow me to cut you short, and then we're going to come back to you. We have to fix something, and then we come back to that after this short break.
Radio 47 tuko nawe mchana kutwa na usiku kucha.
Well, the conversation is towards a secure food Africa, or a secure, yes, food or that is basically what we're discussing this evening, and it's on People's Court. And certainly, of course, we welcome you to be part and parcel of the conversation, even as we continue engaging the specialists that we have on set. At this very moment, when as a country and as Africa, we are discussing just how best we can manage our climatic conditions, it's equally very, very important that we get to understand underneath there are a couple of sectors, there are a couple of matters that need to be looked into keenly. And today we focus on the question of food, just how best placed are we towards making sure that we take care of our environment so that it can take care of us food-wise. And of course, in studio, we have Victor on the other side with the panelists, as well as George on the other side, and right here with me, the lady and the gentleman. And so we take it back to you, Maimoni. Apologies for cutting you short, but basically it was about how best placed are we in terms of making sure that we take care of the environment so that eventually then it takes care of us. And this then would include, guaranteeing us food security.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I mentioned before, what we've seen today, what we experience in Africa today is a system that has been carefully designed and has also been pushed on Africa, believing that we are unable to feed ourselves. When I hear languages like that, I first of all consider it as an insult on those indigenous people who are actually feeding Africa and feeding the world. Because how did we get here is the question we should be asking ourselves, because local people, indigenous people, I don't want to call them local indigenous people, they have been producing enough food to feed us. But because a system has been designed, we experience a lot of land grabbing today in Africa. Nigeria, for example, communities that actually produce the food that feed the larger population of Nigerians, they have lost their land to agro-commodity companies. And when they come in form of investment on agriculture, our government, they are quick at approving land to them without following due process, free, prior, and informed consent, where the community people are supposed to be carried along for them to be aware or to give their consent if that will benefit them. But no, nothing like that. Communities will wake up one morning and they will see bulldozers in their farmlands because government have granted agro-commodities companies access to those lands. And what do? They clear off cultivated land and they clear off forest, which issue of deforestation is also is a factor, and also the food that ought to feed the people is also be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, the food that is produced by the so-called agro-commodity companies, you don't see it being given us sold locally for people to have access to this food, but this food is exported. Mm-hmm. And the people who are, the companies who are fond of this, they are the ones that are into rubber plantations, palm oil plantations. They sell off the palm oil, anything that has to do with the palm, they export it, and they bring the product back to us in form of bleaching creams and what is it called, hair relaxers to the people. Mm-hmm. And these are land that people are supposed to rely on to feed their family and make money, but agro-commodities have hijacked that. And you will not come back to say Africa does lack the capacity to feed itself. That's an insult. Okay? It's an institutional insult. And also, let me take you back to the Niger Delta, where Shell has been reckless for years, and the oil industries have been reckless for years. The land is polluted, the water is polluted, and people lack the ability to produce enough food because their land have been polluted and their waters have been polluted, and you will tell me that our people lack the ability to produce enough food.
Well, good question.
Pollution is also a factor.
All right, and of course, I guess I'll take it away from this very point and to George, and of course, George will certainly take it away to Victor. But then that, George, brings us to a very valid concern. Two concerns perhaps that we have had. Mm-hmm. One concern is on the genuineness of these processes of making sure that, well, we take care of the environment as well as we are fed secure. Mm-hmm. And at this point, not just from the level of Africa, but perhaps at the global perspective, just how genuine are the Westerners in terms of making sure that then we speak the same voice. And George, of concern as well, or perhaps where it is that Maimoni then leaves us, is at a point where we ask ourselves as a people, You know, why is it that it could be working for a certain country, a certain African country, and it is not working for another one? Why is it that when we come to, say, a country like Kenya, it could be working for a certain county and it's not working for another county? Perhaps I'll throw it to you, George, so that, we can have you panelists as well take it up from there.
Absolutely, indeed, and pertinent questions and pertinent concerns brought about by your panelists and your guests. I'm still here with Wanjohi Njoroge, and you've heard, I could see you noted down a few things, and talking about especially the issue of land because that is where pretty much we get our food from the soil, from the earth, rather from land. And Sir Mo Ibrahim earlier on in the session that included the President, Dr. William Ruto, the Vice President, other vice presidents and other, world leaders, they were saying that the contributions, especially from, carbon, this whole conversation on carbon decarbonization and the carbon pits and everything else, it needs to be a commitment, not a donation. So do you think that perhaps this whole conversation on donation is what makes us have this perennial conversation of we are in drought, let's have communities and countries contribute? Where exactly, what will move us from, the current situation we are in to progression?
Unfortunately, we can have this conversation without having conversation on leadership.
Okay.
She asked, why do we have some countries progressing or having it working for some countries and it's not working for other countries or counties in Kenya? It's a question of leadership and people-centered leadership, which is a huge void in Africa. The second thing, the question on genuineness of the efforts. This summit ought to have brought us as a continent to talk in one voice about the issues that are affecting us ahead of UNGA and ahead of COP28.
Yeah.
And the question is, and I've seen very many people demonstrating and asking the question, was this our meeting or was this the Western meeting?
Yeah.
Because really it should have been us having this conversation, driving this conversation, having a really honest conversation of where are we, what is working and what is not working. And
among the things that are not working, Wanjohi, is, for instance, if you do not have, common currencies, if you're still trading with different currencies, you do not have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in, in place, as it were. And
of course, there are baby steps. I don't think we can wake up one day and have it working. And I go back to my initial point of working as regions. It's easier to work as East Africa, work as SADC, before we even move to the whole of Africa, because there's even language barrier, for instance. When I go to certain countries of West Africa, I'm required to speak in French. I go down south, there are those that require me to speak in Portuguese, which I don't know. So if we start from that point, how do we trade with Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan? If we can start that conversation from there. And I always give an example of the egg. So the egg that comes from Uganda travels all the way by road and gets to Nairobi is cheaper than the one that comes from Kiambu. And that is a conversation because the farm inputs in Uganda are not taxed, and these in Kenya are taxed. That leads to the cost of the produce being higher. So, and we don't have to produce the egg. We can produce beef, for instance. What is Uganda not producing that Kenya can produce? And these are some of the conversations that I would expect. Yeah, the tariffs as well. So these are some of the conversations that I expect to see out of such a summit, because it is our issues. Now, when we talk about carbon credits, I'm sorry, I'm not the biggest supporter, because we are saying continue polluting as long as you're paying for it. So how do we hold these countries that are the leading polluters to account and still ask them for their money? The honest truth, we cannot. So Africa Climate Summit was a wonderful opportunity for us to come as a continent, come together and have a conversation as one. But who am I kidding? Who has funded this event? He who feeds the pipe, pays the paper, calls, dictates the tune. And that's the truth. So unless we get to a point where the likes of our banks, and I've seen them talking today, are financing these conversations, Africa will not have a genuine conversation about where we are, where we are going, and holding these countries accountable. Finally, we cannot talk about Africa addressing the food security issue without talking about the debt conversation. So if you're going to talk about carbon credits, can we talk about taking away the debt burden? Because there's no way countries are going to dedicate money to food security, if we have the debt burden, they have health issues, climate change issues, trust me, the priority will not be food. The 10% national budget is not going to go to entirely food security because Africa has its own burdens.
And is that 10% even enough in the first place?
It's not enough, but it is a good starting place, you know. When it rains, and we are expecting the El Ninos, thanks to something called the Indian Ocean Dipole, northeastern will be flooded. As soon as the rains go out, we'll be talking about starvation and drought. So we are, I think Africa is always running. And it's understandable, but on the other hand, I think we have failed to realize that there's power in numbers and we want to go it alone as Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. But I think even SADC is doing better in terms of pushing things together, because when you go to the negotiating table, it becomes easier if you're negotiating as a region or as a continent.
So unity of purpose is what I'm picking from you.
Yes.
Absolutely. Victor, over to you. In terms of research, I mean, when we look at, our lands, the large parcels, I wonder what your guest, Professor, will have to say about, the whole issue of researching and ensuring that our soil is arable enough to be able to produce, what we need, and then what we do not have or are incapable of producing, we can then, have it supplied by other countries without even including taxation.
Yes, indeed. And my panel over here has been listening very keenly to what's been shared. And I believe there's a couple of reactions. And let's start with you, Olaumi. You seemed rather inspired or triggered, perhaps, by something that was said on the other side.
No, I wanted to touch on what my brother over this said about how, adding nuance to the narrative, right? So, yes, Africa can definitely, it has a potential to feed itself and the world for that matter, right? I think let's be clear on that. But it struggles to do so. That's the reality of the situation. And I think we have to be, we have to then think about what are the barriers, what are the reasons for the struggle? And he named so many of them, right? It's not just about access to inputs, right, that farmers need to be productive and to achieve agricultural productivity. It's also about access to the right kind of inputs that are responding to the changing climate. So do they need different seed varieties? Do we need to actually bring back indigenous varieties that we used to plant before that were more climate resilient, but have fallen to the wayside because we have gotten into a habit of importing things that are not indigenous to us and maybe not as nutritious even, right? So there's that. There's issues of land rights, as he mentioned, right? Women, for example, in many countries don't have land rights, even though they're the ones that often toil the land, right? So there's policy change that needs to be done there. There's the issue of pollution, right? So I think we need to have a conversation about, we see the potential, and this summit has focused a lot on potential and has focused a lot on the renewables and the carbon sinks and the whatever. And I think we're right in saying that we want to see more focus on food systems, because the very basic thing in life is to be able to feed yourself, right? If you can't feed yourself, you can't go to work, you can't be fully healthy, right? And that needs to be more of a priority. This potential we really need to discuss here at the summit and at COP and other multilateral platforms, what these barriers are, both globally, where yes, we're talking about money, but then also nationally and locally, where we're talking about policies and who are these policies working or not working for, right? So I really just wanted to put emphasis on that, but also be clear about the fact that that narrative about Africa not feeding itself is not about its potential, but rather about its unfortunate reality, and it should call us to think about why that is the case, right?
And I want us to talk about why that is the case, and particularly what we can do about it before we shift to the science of it, which I think is also very important. Tell me something. An observer would sit back and look at our situation and wonder what's wrong with us, in the sense that as a society, we've been feeding ourselves for generations upon generations. We've had governments in form of traditional chiefs and the different kingdoms that we've had throughout our history. Why is it that now we've got gaps, we've got to be taught about how to look after ourselves? Why is it that we've got to be reminded, hey, we need to feed each other, we need to feed ourselves? Where is the disconnect from perhaps a governance perspective? Or to coin the phrase of one of your countrymen, illustrious countrymen, where did the rain start beating us?
You know, it is a question of leadership, honestly, right? We're failing our people in being able to have the resources and the protection that they need to be able to provide for themselves, right? And of course, there's also like a huge population boom. We've grown since those times, and we haven't adjusted to that. And that is a leadership issue, right? But
your
it's
organization
also
does a lot of that, talking to leadership and talking to people, civic education, as well as lobbying and pushing governments to actually take up some of these things that you're discussing. Talk to us a little bit about that and what gaps you see and what you think needs to be done.
Yeah, so I think the gaps really are, as much as possible, we are a listening organization, right? So one, we don't come with we don't come with agendas. We try to listen. So part of our organization is a whole mobilization aspect, right? And we work a lot with African youth, right? And we want to be responsive to what they see as the big issues in their communities, right? And so we take our cue from what those communities tell us, right? And what African leaders tell us is important for them. Well, you know, we don't just take it without critical thought, right? But we are a listening organization first and foremost, right? And then we are a collaborative organization. So we want to work with leaders, not only public leaders at the highest levels, right? But youth leaders, community leaders, whoever seems to have a pulse on what is needed by the masses, right? And we want to help co-create solutions or help listen to their solutions and take them to places where decisions are made, right? That is what advocacy is. It's responsibility because it's not about us, and that's one of our values, that it's not about us, it's about the people that we're hoping to help, whose voices we hope to help center, right? And I think mostly because we are mostly speaking to large governments, we talk about the issues at national level. Right. So a lot of the time what we're asking for is around things that will free up the finance that is needed to make the changes we want to see. So things like debt reform, things like reforming or making changes to the way that multilateral development banks lend to our countries so that our countries have access to cheap finance so that they're not making decisions between paying off their Eurobond and paying their teachers. Or
their farmers in this case.
Or their farmers, exactly. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So now I want us to shift a little bit to the science.
Right.
Help us understand, and you raised this very important thing, are the ways in which we've grown our food not responsive to the situation that we find ourselves in?
Thank you, Victor, and allow me to say a few things. One is that Africa is annoyingly loud. Africa talks so much. Africa has failed to understand that it's she's the big brother in this discussion.
Oh, is that so? And
Africa, interestingly, has failed to design its own narrative. And I'll give you 3-4 different examples to back this discussion. You know, we didn't need to get the hula-baloo of the media like we've got in this Africa Summit, Climate Summit. We just needed Africans to get in KICC, lock themselves there, make decisions, and get away quietly and scheme for it. Because what Africa should know is that it's a design, and that's why I like my friend from Nigeria. There is anytime there is a technology, there is also immediate, what I would say, a very deliberate effort to make sure that Africa also doesn't benefit significantly
from the same technology.
From the same technology.
Right.
And this is, Africa has bought into this madness and is really playing around it. Let me give you an example. The discussions we are having now about the climate was created way early when the developed world was actually using coal, C-O-A-L, to industrialize, to drive energy.
Right.
And that is how the electricity and industrialization happened. When it was time for Africa to also benefit and industrialize itself, there was another caveat.
Suddenly.
It was all of a sudden, coal was declared dirty energy. And in this country, very country, in Kitui here, is a county next door for our brothers outside this country. We have a lot of deposits of coal, but we are struggling to even get enough electricity in this country. But now there's another caveat. You can't use it.
It's dirty.
So who is paying for our coal that is sitting here that was never used to industrialize this country and Africa at large? So we wasted time. At that particular point, probably we were wondering how electricity is behaving. Then in 1940s, something happened. It started by a gentleman called Norman Borlaug, Green Revolution. That is where there was need to mix and synchronize high yielding and mechanization. That is when the tractors, harvesters, and everything else was happening. Mexico became the first, actually the leading exporter of wheat. The US picked it, Asia picked it, China picked it, India picked it.
What about Africa?
And they really developed very well, and they are largely food secure. When it was our time now to use tractors in the right sizes and start using mechanization and a few other things, there was again another caveat. Do you know what it is? Carbon credit. It is now that we are being asked, before you export your horticultural stuff, you'll be asked, how much of a carbon footprint has this your tomato triggered? And we are being asked, and this has happened for the next 30 years. So that narrative, again, we have lost it. Now, let me tell you another one that is very interesting, that Africa has failed to understand. Right. It is also another deliberate thing. Right. It is called recombinant DNA technology. The recombinant DNA technology is the technology that I learned for my PhD. It's called genetic engineering. How do you... Are we coming into the realm? Yes, to where you are coming in. Right. And this, the first genetically modified crop, was commercialized in 1994. If your mathematics is right, Victor, we're just 1 year shy from 30 years. 30 years. Okay? And it was in the US. But you will be amazed that we have even NGOs and other organizations here who would come in Africa and tell us that GMO is very bad. They have the headquarters in the US where GMO has been eaten for the last 30 years. But they love us so much. In Africa, we shouldn't touch GMO. It's bad. It causes cancer. It's really so bad. It causes many crazy things. And let me explain for you, because that's a technology. Please, yeah, talk to us a little bit about it. It's a technology that I know. And recently, I started telling the people that they must know that they are losing in this technology. It's 30 years. And in another 10, 15 years, we will leave this conventional, this GMO we are making noise about here. We will move to something else we are calling genome editing. I am already doing it at Kenyatta University. In this country, the first GMO lab was commissioned in 2004. That's 18 years. We have been making our genetically modified foods here at Kenyatta University. I have led that lab before even going into becoming a manager. And this is, South Africa was sharp enough when in 1994, 4 years later, in 1998, they adopted it.
But now, Prof, in a moment, let me cut in for a second.
Go ahead.
So, are you saying, in essence, that the way we've been growing food is outdated?
This is how it happens.
And it's been designed to be like that to keep us in some sort of bondage.
Technologies, when we talk about climate change, it's nothing else apart from temperatures rising and colder areas becoming cold. By the way, that's everything else. And do you know what climate change does? It only affects the formations that have DNA. And what do I mean? DNA is just in the things that only live. The living things. Okay. So it is plants, it is bacteria, it is viruses, and those are the only things that are affected by climate change. Unfortunately, those are the same things that we also eat. Right. And therefore, as human beings and as animals, so this is what happens. Right. When climate changes, the crops that were previously tolerant, for instance, to drought or to diseases become susceptible. And sometimes the viruses or the bacteria or the animals that were not really susceptible or were not virulent, virulent means that they're not causing disease, become more virulent. And so that you know that it is a narrative around GMO, let me break for you so that you understand what is this
Please.
DNA I keep talking about.
Okay, okay.
When you are eating rice and beans, for instance, you are taking carbohydrates from rice and you are looking for proteins from beans. That is why actually you don't need to take beans if rice had had proteins. And anything that you see alive, Victor, that you, be it bacteria, plants, or anything else, even us, in our DNA, in the genome, in the nucleus, we only have 4 letters. And so that you understand how this thing is being, we only have 4 letters, A, T, G, and C, only. And what happens...
I'm afraid we're starting to get rather technical.
No, I don't want to be technical.
Right.
Those 4 letters are just repeating themselves in a unique sequence. So,
Okay.
for instance...
It's a code.
It's a code. So for human beings, for instance, we have those letters repeating themselves in a unique sequence 3.2 billion times. Now, ask me this question. Then what happens? The technology of sequencing means that you can get to know within this code which section of the code is responsible for the skin color, which one is responsible for proteins, which one is responsible for carbohydrates.
Okay.
Now, when you are eating beans and rice, do you go inside there to remove the DNA?
No.
You are eating it together with the DNA.
In fact, you add spice on it.
You add spices on it.
Correct.
So you are mixing in your mouth, it is genetically mixed food. Because you are eating the DNA of beans and you are eating the DNA of rice. And if you are also having salad, you are eating the DNA of vegetable, and all that is happening. And do you know what you're looking for? You're looking for the nutrients that the DNA expresses.
I see.
Now, what we do as genetic engineers is that when you are eating, say, beans and rice, for instance, you cannot cross them so that you get, because you want carbohydrates from...
You cannot make one...
You cannot cross them so that
item.
you get one plant that is giving you proteins and at the same time,
Right.
naturally, because of what we call the species barrier.
Right.
Now, the only science that we know as genetic engineers is that, yes, you naturally eat the beans, right? Because you are looking for the proteins. And now the climate has changed such that beans cannot grow because the soil is struggling or probably the temperature is too much, but human beings still require proteins.
Right.
The genetic engineer comes and looks at the genome, the code of beans,
Okay.
and you say, out of this big code, what section of this DNA, which you naturally eat in beans, and you don't grow leaves, and I'll ask you later on what happens to that DNA,
Right.
so that you understand. You cut that section and move it into the DNA of rice, which you also naturally eat, okay? So because at the DNA level, the letters are the same. And we have sequence and we have technologies to do that.
So what does that result in?
So when I move that DNA that you naturally eat from beans and move it into the DNA of rice, do you know at that point that rice is called GMO?
I see.
Because it has picked the genes from the beans that naturally cannot cross to give you a plant.
Right, right.
Imagine that is the whole story about the GMO.
So that
and that is so bad that it is really killing. And you can grow leaves and it is really...
Prof,
Do you
in a
know
moment,
what that means?
I get you.
That is the narrative that I keep telling you. And the whole idea here is...
Hold on, Prof. Hold on. I think it's important to tell our audiences that what Prof has said in the last bit is heavily laced with sarcasm. It doesn't mean you're not going to grow leaves. And indeed, you know, and thank you indeed for the brief lesson. Basically, PhD level GMO genetics and everything brought down to our. Thank you so much for that. But we will come back because I now want to beyond the science, which you've attempted to help us to understand. I would like to talk a little bit about the politics of it and perhaps solutions. What can we do to take this technology, biotechnology, to make us better? We've done biotechnology before. We've bred different breeds of cows and chicken. We've bred different plants to get the best out of them. Yeah. You'll talk to us a little bit about that. Yeah. But just at this point, allow me to shift to my colleague Linda, who's got people who I believe were reacting and responding to, I don't know whether they were responding to the science or the sarcasm. Linda, take it away.
It's quite brain cracking, I must admit. It's the science and the sarcasm, I must admit as well. Let's take it to you, Zuki. And innovation and technology is something we can't run away from. And we all agree that, Prof reminds us of just how important it should be for us to grab that and run away with all this knowledge. We keep pointing fingers, or we keep saying that, well, Israel is doing well, thanks to technology and innovation, being a desert. And we have seen African countries that have adopted, this GMO conversation, that today South Africa will go that direction and perhaps, try to get its citizens to a food secure state. A different country will try and adapt that, take an innovation. Egypt will do that. But other countries still, are taking a backseat and asking themselves, we need to do more research, we need to ask more and all that. What will it take for us to embrace technology and innovation in a way that will not harm us?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I think the science is incredibly interesting and incredibly important because the world all around us is changing, it's becoming fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And so the way in which we produce food, as well as other things, needs to shift alongside that as well. And I think the Prof, it was very interesting, perspective that the Prof put forward and unpacking the science of GMOs specifically. And I think, for me, the important aspect of what the Prof is saying is that it is possible to produce food that is nutritious and that we can have abundantly available to meet the needs of our people. Of course, I'll have to register for a new degree to fully understand, but that it is a key point, right, that it is possible. But in that, we need political solutions in order to realize that potential. And within the current system, global system, I think again the Prof is right, that it is one in which African countries, continent as a whole, has deliberately been kept down, so that a certain quality of life can be maintained abroad in the global north specifically. And this is the reality of neocolonialism, right? And this is what we are continuing to see across the African continent, is the ongoing exploitation, extraction, and dispossession of African resources, exploitation of African people, in order to, in relation to this discussion, and in relation to many of the campaigns that we are working on and actively opposing, like the East African Crude Oil Pipeline Project. It is, the reality of African resources being exploited in order to service the energy needs of countries abroad. And in that process, and I think even to go back to what my comrade and colleague from Friends from the Earth, Africa, had said, in that process, we are becoming increasingly food insecure, increasingly excluded, increasingly vulnerable. And our inequalities are becoming more and more deeply seated and deeply rooted. And we see this with the comrade made the example of the way in which the agriculture industry is set up. And of course, in that example, you'll find there's a lot of food that is produced on the continent for export.
Right.
And this is the point I made at the beginning around food being produced in order to produce profit, right, instead of meeting the needs of people. Just quickly. But this is we see throughout the fossil fuel industry as well. In South Africa, we see it with mining corporations that push people off of their land, and when they do that, what they do is people are unable to produce food for themselves, to feed themselves in the way that they've always known and practiced. But included in that, they are pushed into wage labor. Right, so this is the other aspect that comes in. So people are, their subsistent modes of living and existence are completely dismantled and destroyed and disrupted. And what happens instead is people are produced into cheap menial jobs where they are now producing in order to service others and to line the pockets of others. Right? Yeah. And and at that point, people are now only earning enough in order to reproduce their labor for the next day. They are not earning enough to live meaningful and lives of meaning, and of lives where you can contribute to the family, to the home, as well as to your community and your political context. It's the same thing we see in the case of ECOP, where currently where the project is at, this land acquisition process has pushed up to 100,000 people off of their land. And in doing so, has resulted in many families being unable to cultivate or harvest their crops that they've had to leave behind,
Right.
Unable to continue to access the income generating streams that they've always had, and in that losing access to services like education, to healthcare, but also becoming increasingly food insecure as a result.
And we're going to come to what then the role of the people would be in this conversation.
Solution.
Yes, but even before it gets to that, I want you to pass the mic to Josephat. Josephat, quickly, development experts and political leaders all agree, and I think this evening we all agree, that Africa's enormous agricultural potential, if tapped well, then can actually field the continent and as well feed the global fraternity. But then we want to ask ourselves this evening, are the stakeholders involved, corner to corner, round, to make sure that everybody then is, on the table and perhaps discussing these solutions? And by this, then I would want to ask specifically about the farmers. Africa Development Bank advised Africa governments, that is some times back, to make sure that they empower smallholder farmers. And beyond the smallholder farmers, even the large-scale farmers. I mean, basically every player, do you suppose they're involved in these conversations of policy making, in these conversations of making sure that we have implementation of these very policies? Or is just the government and, the development experts that actually have a conversation in a room and then they come and tell the farmers this, that?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation and an interesting question also, because there's a breakdown between the policy developers, policy implementers, and policy adapters. At the small-scale farmer level, that is a policy adapter.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, people like the World Bank, they finance policy developments, but there's a big problem when it comes to implementations. And that's when we came up, that's why we came up with a cooperative, basically development for the people, by the people, with the people. So as a cooperative, we adapt whatever policies are there and work with the adopters, basically the small-scale farmers, and tell them this is what should be done and this is how it should be done. Basically from selecting the best farm inputs to the process of production, to the process of food handling and distribution to the end consumer.
Right.
So when mostly policies are being discussed, small-scale farmers or representatives of small-scale farmers mostly are not on that table. And it's an unfortunate aspect that we have in Africa, because if you look at developed countries, farmers have a very big say when it comes to food production. But in Africa, the largest population of food producers are small-scale farmers, yet they are minimally represented and taken advantage of within the value chain approach. The other part is that the food system basically is broken.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense that small-scale farmers are the most poorest within our communities, yet they produce the highest amount of food locally and for export purposes. Yet, the consumers who are purchasing this food are not able to purchase this food. Why? Because first of all, it's not accessible. Second of all, it's not affordable. So we want to make a food system that is democratically owned by the consumers and also the food producers. In a sense that you as a farmer, you as a consumer, you're getting value for your money as a consumer and also getting value for your produce as a farmer. Because if we let it to the big foods and the big pharma industry, they will continue exploiting the African farmers and profits will always go to them.
Right.
We have seen so much investments being placed in Africa. Unfortunately, it's not reaching the small-scale farmer. Why? Because the implementers and adopters speak different languages. And you find that there's no political goodwill also. I was listening to an interview with Githongori MP, Wamoshomba, and she was saying when a government officer or any politicians gets into any value chain, we have seen it in coffee, we have seen it in tea, we have seen it in pyrethrum, if there is no political goodwill, then small-scale farmers will always complain they have no access to markets. So what do? We need to come together as the people who are being affected.
Right.
Ensure that we develop systems that will benefit us and let not any other person. There is a principle within the cooperative that states that cooperatives are autonomous and independent.
Yeah.
And the only solution that we need to embrace is coming together through cooperatives.
Right.
And in Kenya, every value chain that had a cooperative, there was development. In fact, the cooperative movement in Kenya is number 1 in Africa and number 7 globally.
Right.
So we need to embrace people coming together. We are Ubuntu,
Yeah.
Omuntu,
Yeah.
Modo.
Right.
We are people. When we come together as Africans, we have the solutions. We do not need any other person from the outside to tell us what to do. We have the land, we have the people. The only part that we lack is unity.
Well, we say the African Climate Summit is the beginning to that. We can only cross fingers for the same. But equally, the youth are, great players. I heard President William Ruto yesterday alluding to just how important it is for us as a people to involve the youth in this conversation and, of course, to get them in that space of understanding technology, farming technology for that matter, or agricultural technology. But for a long time, we have not considered agriculture to be a potentially lucrative venture. How do we shift this and get the youth involved, which actually, this is a group that perhaps takes the highest number in terms of representation across the African continent?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I totally agree that, the continent is blessed to the fact that we have the youngest population ever.
Right.
And for years and in history, I think agriculture has been the greatest contributor to, the GDP in most of the economies that we have. We have economies like Burundi that produce a lot of, food, but still are poor somehow. So touching on what the other colleagues have mentioned around what's wrong with the food system, what's wrong with the value chain. So I think at the moment, it's interesting. The youths always take up what's trending. So how can we make agriculture trend? How can we make food security trend? How can we make it, package it in a way that will make it, trend for the youth, I think, and the Gen Z. So I think the fact that if you've noticed lately, there's this conversation around nature-based solutions, going back to indigenous, food crops, indigenous ways of farming, indigenous, ways of prepping land and so forth and so on. And I have colleagues in the space who work in nature-based solutions, and they're looking at youths and people in the Gen Z generation that have organizations and CBOs that are focused on smallholder farming or farming for climate justice and trying to build climate adaptation. So I feel like that's a nice segue to where we can bring the youth in, because now the climate crisis is trending, the climate change is trending. So now we can say, hey, climate change and food security isn't separate, like that part and parcel. So in that way, then, how do we bring that conversation forward and more and bring it more closer to the people as well? And I like that we touched on an aspect of research. I think there's like an even amount of research out there, but we need to break it down and make it palatable. Make it make sense to the youth. Like as you said, as we started the show, a big chunk of the people who listen here are youth.
Right.
So how do we break down those big jargons around agriculture and food security? Because at the end of the day, everyone eats. So I think it won't be very hard to make it, important to the youth as well.
Right. Well, indeed, everyone eats. So we come to you, Maimoni, and, when we talk about starvation, there is always two extremes to this. It's going to be flood. If it is not flood, then it is drought. And then, Zaki brings us to a point where we realize that as well, the people who most of the laws across the African continent will speak of them enjoying sovereignty are always complaining. Are we vulnerable to that point? Are we pushed to a level where then the people do not have a say? If not so, then what is the role of every individual towards making sure that we address this concern of food, if not climate challenge?
Okay, thank you very much. Before I answer this question, I want to thank Prof for breaking that conversation, the GM conversation issue into this conversation. Particularly, I have that belief that any science that doesn't have a human face is evil. That is the way I take it. And he sounded so convincing, but for the fact that I'm part of this conversation, I want to dissociate myself from such belief that GMOs is what Africa needs. That is a bad principle. That is a bad technology, because GMOs, as we speak, they are unproductive. GMOs will further incinerate Africa. GMOs will further impoverish Africa, because GM technologies have proven to be bad technologies globally. The records are there. So if Prof is wasting taxpayers' money to be developing GM research, I will just say, Prof, stop developing researches that will further incinerate those that are generating these funds for such research. Sorry, I have to start this way.
And perhaps Prof speaks from a basis of research, and will allow him to.
Yeah, I know what Prof is saying.
Yes.
Okay, these are technologies that have failed in many parts of the world. That is why there are cases where the issue of patent, you must label. If you produce, you must label. Because when we talk about the issue of food sovereignty, we are not only talking about food security. We are talking about food sovereignty. I must have the right to what I want to eat. So you don't tell me you want to use GMO to feed me. I am not guinea pigs. Even guinea pigs have rejected GMOs.
And we'll go ahead to say, okay. We are a set of facts, and so we proceed to say, where has it failed?
Sorry, let me land,
yes.
because audiences are listening to us.
Yes.
So they have to also jump into the report to also understand the processes. Now, by the time we allow GMOs to set in, we are going to lose our local seed, our local varieties. This is very, very critical. That is why we are singing the song that agroecology is the way. Agroecology is what we should be preaching at this time, not GMOs. Because if we are saying that those in the global north, they are pushing agenda on us, then how come should we be accepting the GMOs that they don't even consume in their own countries? So that is the agenda.
Right.
Then coming back to the question is that, yes, every individual have a right or have a responsibility to play in assuring the aspect of food security. So first of all, it is driven by policy. What are our policies? How does our policy look like? I was just sharing with my brother before we came in what has happened to rural infrastructures. This is very critical. Government have the right responsibility to provide rural infrastructure. Unfortunately, those people that produce this food, there is no access road that leads to those communities. So there is high level of post-harvest loss. And this is a conversation that must be brought to the table. Post-harvest loss. That is the reason why they feel that we don't feed ourselves. People who produce this food, eating the food alone is not enough. They also need to sell this food to generate income, to do other things. But because there are no facilities for storage, there are no facility for transportation. Most of this food, almost 70% of the food that is produced in these rural communities are wasted.
They come back to us.
Okay?
Yeah.
So government needs to wake up to that responsibility instead of romancing with those from the global north. That is what African government needs to do.
Right.
Secondly,
quick one here.
We have to, what mechanisms do we have? The method of food production that was being used in 1940s, before we start talking about what we see today, that indigenous knowledge, where is it? So we need to start adopting it. Because I remember when growing up, because of course I was raised with the use of wood, using firewood to cook. The ash, in the morning, if you throw the ash away, you are going to be punished. Because the ashes from the cooking process, they are gathered and taken to the farm. It was on the process where I studied agriculture, I knew the usefulness of that ash to the crop production. These are local knowledge that we are not actually, that are not in history, that we don't even think about.
Let's have the mic.
We don't also do researches to know what is missing from the soil.
Maimoni, I remind you what Ola said, the changes that we've witnessed in the world today, of course, including population growth and all that. Would we still sustain ourselves with the very same styles that we had then, the organic way of doing things.
Yes, so I don't believe in that population growth being a factor, because even our forefathers, they used to marry more than 5 wives.
And getting 7 children.
So that
Fair
they
enough.
be able to farm and produce enough food.
Before we throw it to
population
Victor,
growth, I don't
to
think- I
have
don't agree
them
with the factor.
respond, allow us to loop in George. George, valid points there.
Yes, indeed, absolutely, Linda, and valid points that are being raised, by your panelists, by your guests. But as we bring this conversation to a close, as we enter the home stretch, I'm still here with my guest, that is Wanjohi Njoroge, a climate and nature restoration consultant. As we also pick your closing remarks, especially on what needs to be done. As young people, why are we not seeing, one, the incentive to participate, or even, the young people are pretty much running away from farming, from agriculture. And secondly, what are some of the solutions that you would like to see, even in your capacity as a young person, to try and then have this conversation on food security, food secure Africa, progress from where we are to wherever you would like it to be?
Thank you very much. I think first and foremost, the reason as to why even I, as a young person, I would not be attracted into farming is because everything I grow wastes away.
And you've done that before?
Yes, or there is overproduction and then I end up feeding the cows, or there are wrangles between the cooperatives or the seller. If I sell coffee and tea, and then now I'm stuck in the storage with my coffee beans and I don't know what to do with them. So, I mean, agriculture is so unreliable that I would rather go elsewhere and not farm. But then, and I'm going to go back to the smallholder farmers. Africa has 33 million smallholder farmers that contribute to 70% of the food supply in Africa. And so we do not have to look for large-scale farmers. My argument and my belief is that if we focused on enabling these ones, there's something called contract farming, for instance, that we agree, KFC imports potatoes because they don't have that variety in Kenya. Somebody in Kenya signed to that agreement that, you can bring your potatoes from outside, yet I come from a village that produces potatoes. So even some of these agreements that we are signing, we need to question them. If we connected these 33 million to markets locally and regionally, trust me, farming will be very, very attractive. The other thing is that we need to finance. We need to put money into agriculture. The same way we are talking about climate change, the same way we are talking about carbon credits, can we start talking about agriculture and putting money, visible and tangible money into agriculture? And I promise you, it will not be just young people who come into it. Thirdly, let us revive cooperatives. I'm a daughter of cooperatives. Had it not been for the milk cooperative in my village, I would not have gone to school. We had farm extension officers who would come to our farms to tell us the quality of soil is weak, and that is why this area, you need to introduce crop rotation, for instance. So those simple things need to come back.
Back to the basics, as you've heard.
Back to the basics. I am personally, I will not eat GMO knowingly.
Okay.
And in my house, I don't cook it. But if I eat in a hotel and probably eat it, then I will. And I think there ought to be honesty that when I'm buying these seeds, I'm buying GMO, and let me make the choice to buy it. I feel there is need for us to protect the traditional seeds. I feel there is need for us to, those of us who want to continue farming the traditional foods, how can we enhance this this variety, and how can we increase it? Because why is the West insisting on us exporting what is grown naturally, yet insisting on us turning to GMO as a solution for our food insecurity? I think we need to have very, very honest conversations around food security.
Thank you so much, Wanjohi Njoroge, a climate and nature restoration consultant, speaking on matters, food security towards a food secure Africa, unity of purpose, and going back to the basics, and also being careful of what we sign. These are some of the calls that we have, and we sure hope that indeed, even as you go to COP28, the Nairobi Declaration will perhaps even encompass these issues that we've been talking about. That's it from my end. George Maringa, over to you, Victor Miyakane, for the closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, George, and thank you, Wanjohi, for that wonderful submission. I need you to tell us, from where you sit, what solutions would you propose to sort this problem out once and for all?
Once and for all is a tall order, but I'll tell you what I think some of our organizational priorities are. So I think from the climate change, within the context of climate change, we need to see more finance for adaptation. Why is that? Because agriculture is one of the sectors most hit by climate change, and one of the sectors that needs to adapt the quickest, right? It's like it's forced to. And there's just not enough money flowing into adaptation, and specifically into locally led adaptation, right? So when we're asking for is a doubling of adaptation finance from developed countries, sure, but also just in general, even within our own governments, right? And for that to be trickled down to people like the smallholder farmers that actually need it the most, right? So it has to be determined, the use of that money has to be determined by the people on the ground. That's one. The second thing I would say is about investing in rural infrastructure, as our brother mentioned. I think it is core to have the right kind of electricity, to have the necessary water for irrigation, to have the storage, to have the transport systems. So that is also very important. Infrastructure and reliable infrastructure and climate resilient infrastructure is important. And the third thing I would say is investing in research and innovation, and including indigenous knowledge systems in that. And if I may add a fourth, is to support the bargaining power of smallholder farmers through such initiatives as cooperatives. I started my career in development, working with farmers, so I in cooperatives, and so I know their importance. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Prof, as quick as you can, your solutions to this.
Quite a number. I don't know whether I have another minute to respond to a few things.
As quick as you can.
But I just want to say that GMOs are labeled. For instance, in this country, we have regulations that ensure that they are labeled. And the reason why they are labeled is not because they are unsafe. It is because of choice. You know, there are some people who may not eat particular fish, not because it is GMO.
So people need to have the privilege of choice.
The privilege of choice.
All right.
And also for them to understand that GMO can also be grown organically, because you only picked the DNA is what you moved. But you can actually grow that seed without chemicals, and it will grow normally because it grows normally. So there is that thinking about the organic and the most important.
Perhaps we need to bring you back to talk about
the three
GMO.
solutions are,
yes, please.
One, make sure you invest in the extension officers. Very, very critical, because that is affecting us. Even after they have sprayed on their vegetables, they need to know the time not to harvest so that we don't eat the chemicals.
Good point.
And the second thing, we also need to look at the quality of the seed, because over time with the climate change, the seed changes as well. And that is why it might surprise you to know that the maize that we currently eat and think that it is maize has undergone genetic mutation up to now. The real organic maize looks like it's this size, and it is not Kenyan. It is in Mexico.
Looks very different.
So we must embrace all this together, but must be very cohesive.
All right. And finally?
And finally,
yes,
is to say that we are only asking for coexistence. GMO has never been said, and any scientist who says that it's a silver bullet is lying. There's no one technology that's a silver bullet. Technologies speak to each other, and that is the discussion we need to move on.
Indeed, and I assure you that's a conversation we do need to have with proper time. Yeah. I appreciate both of you for sharing your views, much as the time has been constrained, but we appreciate you for the things you've said, and I hope our Kenyans and African viewers out there have listened to the wisdom that's been on display from when we started up to now, and specifically from the people who've had the good professor and of course our friend originally from Nigeria but currently serving the world through South Africa. Thank you so much. Over to you, Linda. Would you care to give us your last remarks as we close?
Well, thank you so much, Victor. Certainly a conversation about affordability, availability, accessibility, and safety of food. That is what food security is all about. And the question that we leave ourselves with this evening is that just what is the long-term outlook for food security in Africa in this moment of global warming, in this moment of climate change? I don't know whether I'd be allowed a minute or so to let two people say something quickly that is in relation to that. The lady, I mean, you have a plus because you're a lady. You're the only lady, so I'll have two of you say something in relation to just closing it and, you know, the outlook of what food security would look like at this moment where we're talking climate change and global warming.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I think the most important thing I see with food security, and I'll still touch on the angle of youth because those are the people I work with closely. I think one would be inclusion, participation, but also action. I think we're asking to have a seat at the table. Opportunities are coming up, we're getting seats at the table.
Yeah.
Participation, when the table is offered, you better take a seat and sit down, because most of us are still kind of slacking on that as well, because we get opportunities, but are we taking steps to sit down?
Fair enough.
And then finally, the action part. So let's involve ourselves, let's get in the streets, let's participate, let's involve some of the veterans in the agriculture and food security aspects to share more with some of our youths. And, you know, especially when in climate justice and climate action, intersectionality around climate change and food security and water and all those different parts of the world.
Rukia Hames, thank you so much. 30 seconds from the gentleman, one of the gentlemen, 30 seconds. Only 30 seconds, yes.
Look, I think we need diverse solutions to solve the crisis of food insecurity. Yes, we need the technology. Maybe GMOs are not the answer. Personally, I do not know enough about GMOs to say, yes, we need the indigenous solutions. Yes, we need the infrastructure. And we need these diverse array of solutions, and we need multiple people to be involved, but we also need to be very clear with ourselves that we need a complete shock to the system.
Right.
The global system is one that perpetuates, reinforces, and reproduces the inequality that we see, the hunger that we see on this continent. And in order to solve it, we need political solutions, we need to organize, we need to recognize the fact that we are at war with a system that does not care about us, and that is the only way that we will change it, is if we fight that system.
Well, quite a huge conversation. We can't exhaust this evening, but we're glad that we've been able to touch on a couple of matters that have equal importance. Zaki Mamdouh and the coordinator Stop ECOP campaign, thank you so much for speaking to us as the last speaker. And of course, right next to me is Rukia Hames, Africa Regional Organizer at 350africa.org. Thank you so much. Right next to Zaki, Josephat Kinyua, founder, Food Corp Consumer Cooperative Society Limited. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And lastly, Maimoni Ubrejo from Nigeria, Friends of the Earth Africa. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And it's actually ladies from across all bits. Thank you so much for the great conversation this evening, and equally to you for being part and parcel of it. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to go through some of your comments, but we say asante as we look forward to see you again next